We'll need just a minute or two to set up. Gracia.
Yeah.
I forgot to go over with you that we have to get on Zoom. I can show you. You need. This way. Yeah, so we move fine.
Could you announce? By the table.
So can you go to the Mindekirken website? To get on Zoom?
I don't know if I can.
I can help.
So then I gotta get.
We have a found earring. It's a gold star. I want to put it on the table here. So if you have your slideshow ready,
Yeah.
so you can minimize it. Yeah, there you go. Mindekirken.org. You know that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier. It's to be sent.
Okay, she's turned the sound on now. Oh no, I have you. You're on.
Okay.
And then can you get your video? 3 dots. Start video.
Okay. Is that okay? Okay. Is that going now? Technology is a friend and foe. So the Minneapolis Into My celebrations And remember, they were going on all around wherever there were Norwegians in the little country churches and cities. They're still doing that in many of those places. But the real Sittemai started to happen after the Ole Bull statue was put up in Loring Park in 1896. It was a copy. And then 1897, they dedicated the statue, and I'll show you that in a minute. And so then by 1905, Alfred Dahl, who was the head of the male chorus organization in the city, said, let's have a real celebration at the statue every year. And so it began then really in 1905, a kind of tradition. They were doing it before, but this tradition started in 1905. You would have a young girl in a bunad put a wreath on the Ole Bull statue. Someone would speak about Norwegian Constitution Day, any number of things. And then they would have the choirs singing. They would usually sing Javielsker and other songs that were part of their repertoire. And that began a day of celebrations throughout the two cities, St. Paul and Minneapolis. They would have luncheons. And then they had a huge celebration in the Minneapolis auditorium that would be sometimes packed with 10,000 people, depended on when. And then they had church services frequently in churches around the city. Mindekirken, of course, was built to have a celebration in it until the basement in 1926. So Alfred Dahl had started that, and he did this for many years. So there would be traditional gatherings at the Ole Bull statue, you see here. And as I said, the choir would sing, the girl would place a wreath at the foot of the statue, and it was kind of like being the butter queen. You would get chosen from all kinds of people to do this. And the music and speeches would be there, and then the celebrations began. Now, the Young People's Society at Mindekirken, which started really before the church, they started the church in some ways, but they would plan the 17 Mai celebrations after they started in 1922. And they don't keep very good records of that, but you can tell they were thinking about it in some of their minutes. So they would plan it so that the church, after these celebrations down at Loring Park and throughout the city, they would have a service maybe in the evening. But they didn't want to compete with the big one in the auditorium either. So they might do it the day before or after. Now, in 1939, it was very exciting. Crown Prince and Princess visited the United States, and they visited especially Minneapolis and the Norwegian communities all throughout America. And it was the World's Fair in New York. And many royals from Europe came over, not just to open their exhibit at the World's Fair, but to visit the Roosevelts because they knew stuff was going to happen. So they wanted to make friends with the Roosevelts. Crown Princess, as you know, became very, if you've seen Atlantic Crossings, came and lived here and became, Magda became very friendly with the Roosevelts. And that was very important to the kind of the progress of the war. They made a favorable impression, and there were thousands of people who came out to see them. They weren't here to publicly celebrate 17 Mai. They were here in April when they visited several places like St. Olaf. And then they went around and they came back in June. They did not come to Mindekirken, but Mindekirken people were involved. They visited St. Olaf, Augsburg, Luther Seminary, Luther College, Ebenezer, and Lingblomsen. Those are kind of the points on the royal trips whenever they come. They go to see kind of their colonies. This is where Norwegian America still exists. So it was a very happy, joyful time in 1939. Then when the Nazis invaded Norway on April 9th, as you remember, this is a very famous picture too, of Håkon and his cabinet fleeing. And it was noted in the minutes in English in very strong script. The Nazis invaded Norway, April 9th, 1940. And then a month later, it was Syttende Mai. Now, the people who had been planning Syttende Mai celebrations throughout the Minnesota area had their plans in place, but everything changed in April. So it was a sad celebration. This is what the paper said, a sad celebration of Syttende Mai. Now, the Norwegians were front page news with their celebrations for many years. The papers knew that Norwegians were a very large part of their readership. So even though they had been planned, they changed in light of the invasion. They still had the Loring Park celebration with Ole Bull statue, and the Minneapolis auditorium was filled. And people who hadn't been involved in Norwegian American things like this suddenly became interested because it was their heritage and they were on the side of the Norwegian people in their captivity. So there were huge outpourings of interest. The Norwegian choruses, the Nina Grieg choir sang. Governor Stassen, the young man who was governor of Minnesota, spoke. Sons of Norway spoke. Dr. Johan Arndt Osgaard, who was the head of the Norwegian Lutheran Church in America, he was a good friend of Håkon VII and had written many, many letters to him back and forth before the war. But he became kind of the person to speak on behalf of Norway to the Americans. Then the Daughters of Norway and Val Bjornson was the big speaker that day. And Mindekirken people participated. And one of them said, a year ago, we celebrated with the royals, and now it's sad. So Mindekirken then became a place from which the resistance had a forum. And Rasmussen, the pastor then, was very clear to give people from Norway who came a place to speak. He also became part of the public leadership. He appears, for instance, in the Minneapolis paper with this ad for The Moon is Down. You know, Steinbeck wrote a novel about what it was like to be in Norway when it was led by or governed by the Nazis. And Rasmussen was named the Secretary of Norwegian Relief in Minnesota, which became American for Norwegian relief later. And their goal was to raise $1 million by 1941. And Mindekirken had prayer services for the welfare of Norwegians on the anniversary of the invasion on April 9th. And they decided that they would send clothes and ready-made homes to Norway. Now, they always said it was going to happen after the war, but after the war, people heard that it was coming through Sweden into northern Norway especially, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But Rasmussen was very deeply involved in that. Syttende Mai, 1941. Now remember, the United States is still not in the war, but the whole sense of threat was increasing, and the Lend-Lease program, Norwegians were trying to get FDR to do something called Lend-Lease. So they would lend their arms to the British and then get paid back for them after the war. And that was very important to the Norwegians. And in the movie, Princess Martha is very involved in that. So once again, Syttende Mai 1941, they had the same thing happen. Traditional wreath laying, here's the little girl going to lay it. Then they sang national hymns. And then they had an address by William McNally, who was an editor of Minneapolis Star and the Tribune and had to do with the Minneapolis Journal. And in this event, then people were looking back to the Norwegian history. So they had a tableau of Viking garb and Viking ship. And there was a speech by the Minnesota Senator, Joseph Ball, who was not isolationist. There were two politicians in Minnesota who were strongly isolationist, and the Norwegians reacted strongly against them, even if they were Norwegian Americans. Shipstead And Charles Lindbergh was Swedish, but he was very strongly anti getting involved. Joseph Ball gave a speech then in the auditorium that night against isolationism. And the Norwegian Relief Committee was in charge of that celebration and began to raise all kinds of money for this. Joseph Ball defended Lend-Lease and wanted it to go as well to Norway. And this entire program was broadcast so that Norwegians could hear it. They ran with the tapes, they flew them to the East Coast where they could be broadcast. And in October of that year, over 1,000 gathered here and protested against the isolationism of their politicians. And they sent a letter to FDR saying they were for whatever he did in trying to defend Europe, especially Norway. Once again, there were songs by Norwegian choirs. It was an exciting day, but it was focused on helping Norway. And 17. Mai 1942, Crown Prince Olaf and Crown Prince Märta, Princess Märta, visited the Twin Cities just before that. They went to munitions factories up in, where's the one up? Iron Hills. And they went around very quietly. They didn't raise a lot of, they did raise a lot of interest, but they were focused on getting the soldiers in Norway armed. And when they came, Prince Olaf spoke at the Minneapolis Auditorium to this crowd. Now, he was confident of victory over Germany. And there's an interesting development too. A Swedish nurse spoke at the Minneapolis Auditorium celebration on the 17th of May. And Carl Sandburg represented a Swedish contingent of people who supported the resistance. And they helped with getting this material through into Northern Norway. We can say a lot about Sweden, which we could do. But there were many people who did help. When I was leaving Norway in 1966, in the spring, I got on a train, and in my compartment, there was a woman who had just come from Sweden to Norway to celebrate the resistance. And she talked practically the whole way to Fredrikstad about what they had done and how the rest of the Swedish authorities hadn't understood what they were doing. So I have a clear and vivid memory of that. There was a concert that evening in the auditorium by Christian Thorberg. And then Jon Nygaardsvold, the prime minister, was here. And he spoke at the auditorium as well. And Mindekirken then invited Fredrik Hastlund, who spoke to the church on May 20th. They didn't want to compete with the big celebration. And he's the one who, with his sister and her husband, got all the gold out of Norway. That's a thrilling story. And I don't have time to tell it all here, but how he got this $70 million worth of gold up through Åndalsnes out to the sea and on its way to Great Britain is a thrilling story. And then they decided it should be in the United States. So then they brought it again to the United States. So he must have thrilled the audience with his story when he came here to give the speech. In 1943 was the 35th year of the Wreathing Choirs at Loring Park and the Ole Bull statue. Henry Thompson, a pastor over at Minnehaha Church, gave the invocation. And they had high school choirs this time. The Boy Scouts were there. And the governor, Edward T, or Thigh, I suppose they called him. They call him Thigh. He was Norwegian American and was governor at the time. So he came to these events. He was always present among these events to celebrate and support the people. He was Norwegian American. He probably spoke Norwegian growing up as he did. He was born in South Dakota, but moved here. Very important supporter of all this. In the evening of 17 Mai 1943, they had a celebration here at the church that was specifically for the church. They didn't go to the auditorium. They had Leif T. Gulbrandsen of the Siemens Mission Church in Brooklyn. They had Sverre Nordberg, who was a very strong supporter. He was at the University of Minnesota. He'd been at Augsburg, and he was also part of the OSS and worked in the Secret Service for America as an American Norwegian citizen. Elias Rasmussen sang a solo, undoubtedly Grieg. He was very accomplished at that. Walter Hansen and Ruth Dolliger, pictured here, was the organist, and Rasmussen's daughter played for him. Here's Norberg and Rasmussen, who were at that celebration. In 1944, they could see that victory was coming. You could feel the optimism begin. Herman Jorgensen was the president of the congregation through much of this time. He was the editor of Lutheranen, the Norwegian Lutheran Church of America's Norwegian journal. And he was a very strong member here and was president and was very helpful to Rasmussen and the congregation. And he went to Norway right after the war, came back and reported how conditions were. He was a very important member. I ministered to him when I was nurse's aide at Ebenezer, as he was dying, he and his wife. Once again, this was at Loring Park. Alfred Dahl led. He's on all these pictures. And Arne Haugland, the attaché of Norwegian embassy, was the speaker. So they always brought someone in from the resistance, from the government in exile. Here's Herman Jorgensen, a very important member at the time. Then in 1945, of course, the victory was absolutely amazing, as it was in Norway. And the people here had relatives who would write them letters from Norway saying how their conditions were and how things were going. So the people in this congregation had very vivid pictures of what was going on. So they had shared, especially here, the trauma and the terror of the time. So when the Nazis left Norway, the celebrations were incredible. And the largest crowd ever to attend the opening of the Ole Bull statue was there. And then they had even more people, the Norwegian consul, Reidar Solheim, and Alfred Dahl once again, and William Gosselin, the Minneapolis superintendent of schools. Many people said that because the Norwegian teachers had taught their students to think critically, they were able to resist the Nazi teachings much better than if they had been in Germany, where they'd been taught the propaganda. And they told many teachers came over after the war and talked about what they had done. And one of them showed how the Norwegian students had protested. They'd been asked to go to a Nazi art exhibit, and they all wore dark sunglasses. Norwegians really know how to irritate authorities. And so that was a story that was told also. Once again, the wreath was laid at the foot of the statue. And then the celebration was at the Floyd B. Olsen Memorial Labor Temple. Now, Floyd B. Olsen was also Norwegian American. He was the governor 1933 on, and he was also, he died of cancer in 36, but he had this monument to him. Now, the church service that evening once again featured Rasmussen, Malma, and Solheim. And as the summer went on, they began to learn how much the American Relief for Norway Committee had done. Up to 3/1/45, March 1st, 1945, they had raised and spent nearly $2 million in relief to Norway. They had sent $400,000 to aid the underground, $391,000 for food, $259,000 for medical supplies. And it had gotten through mostly up the northern part of Sweden into Norway. So it wasn't just sitting there waiting to be taken over after the war. It was being used all the time. But it was also true that when peace was declared, they had 8 boxcars from Minneapolis of clothes ready to go to Norway. And that kind of relief effort kept on going out of the church and through Rasmussen and through Åsgard for some time. Åsgard ultimately raised, they say, $23 million for this. So it was amazing what the church congregation and all the others did. So Mindekirken was during the war what Rasmussen called a forum for Norwegian aid and resistance. So from the very first, people came over from the government in exile. Some, even one guy came who took a pseudonym. He had escaped a Nazi prison in Norway, and he rowed with several other sailors to the Orkney Islands and then came over to Camp Little, Norway, up in Toronto. That's another story. Rasmussen supported that very strongly. Camp Little, Norway was where they were hoping to train enough pilots to be part of the Royal Norwegian Air Force. But they went, before that could happen, the war ended. But that was a very important place as well, and I'll tell more about that in the book I'm accidentally writing. So we can be very proud and very glad about this story. And then they moved the moved the parades and the celebrations from the Ole Bull statue to the neighborhood in the 1970s. I think that's what you've said, Cotty. Harry Clavin did that. Anyway, that's the story as I have it so far. Thank you.
Questions?
We do have time for questions. If someone would like to ask a question, so to make sure it's myself.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
So Zoom people can hear.
My name is Brandon Olson. I remember going to Loring Park for the Ole Bull statue. I've been on the Norway Day committee for many years. And I remember at Loring Park, at least 1 or 2 years, we had a tent there, we had musicians, we had everything there. I remember having stuff here at Mindekirken,
Right.
over the years, the parades and stuff. I remember finding a picture of a lady playing accordion and the children walking around here. And I remember a lot of things, so I won't go into details, but I've seen a lot of the Seven Wives
Right.
over the years.
Right.
And I want to thank the people that, for last Sunday, for the wonderful time we had.
Right.
And for 2 years, we didn't have anything, but I'm so happy we could have it this year.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, here's one. Yeah. Question over here. Yeah, okay.
Do you know if it was difficult to get the letters out of Norway that were received here?
I don't know how they did that, but somehow they did get them out. I do know that this is a very interesting story that I'm not quite 100% sure of, but Åsgard wanted to get a message to Bergerac. And he knew a woman who was going over to Sweden and would get into Norway. And he didn't write it, he made her memorize it. And he had tested her several times to make sure she had it right. And that message got to him through word of mouth. But that's a great story. And it's been told by Kari Bostrom in her book on Åsgard, a little thesis on Åsgard. but it was hard. Yes, here's one here, yeah.
I have the mic, and
Yeah.
then I'll pass it on to Janet.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I mentioned to Gracia on Sunday when we ran into one another. I remember from childhood coming to Mindekirken, and there were gatherings during the war, and families came, including ours. We were at Central Lutheran, but Normans were with it, for example. And Brendan Hewlett, who was a correspondent for the local paper and was in Norway, assigned to be in Norway to bring back stories. And they were thrilling and emotional, and people gave money and clothes. It was really quite
Right.
something.
Can you summarize?
Right, if you could hear that, Mary Jo was talking about Brenda Yulin. She was a columnist for the paper, and she wrote a lot about Norwegian events and the Sitten Mai celebrations and the war. And she went over there right after the war and wrote back lots of interesting things. She was a real character. She was the daughter of Julan, the lawyer, who was kind of in charge of Norwegian cases from the 80s until the 20s. Yes, yeah.
Can you give us a couple of good books we can read to get this whole history and take time with it and get even more than you've given us? It's just wonderful.
Well, I'm writing one from 1950 to 1959 on up to Rasmussen, and we hope it will be out by the end of the summer, if not the middle of the summer. But a really good book on this is called Norway 1940. And that's a really interesting book. Doesn't tell everything, but that gives you the kind of minute by minute. And then, of course, you can't do much better than Kongens Nye and also the Atlantic Crossings, which I find are historically quite accurate, maybe not in the relations between Martha and Roosevelt quite, but everything that they talk about in the news is on there, so.
I can say, first of all, in my hometown, Bode, there is a special part called Svenskeby, the Swedish town. I know for the first time I got to hear that we probably didn't get those one from Sweden, but from here.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And another thing, reconciliation takes really a long time. And there were the first generations of Norwegians after the war did not want to learn German at all, for instance. So that was one thing. And a good friend of me in Norway, a young friend of me, told me an incident that must have been like 1990, believe it or not. He and his granddaddy was out fishing and doing some stuff, and there were a lot of Germans who were renting cabins around that place just to go there as tourists. And these and his granddaddy was a very kind and nice person and helped everybody he could. But then these Germans who were also out there fishing, they had an outboard motor, and they must not have fastened it good, because all of a sudden the motor was loose and fell down and drowned, of course, in the sea. And my good friend Christopher said to his granddaddy, "Granddaddy, we have to go and help them." "No," he said, "they are Germans."
Want to add something about stamps in Norway and censoring of letters and getting letters. My family received many letters that had been censored, but the stamps in particular were interesting because they had been stamped with the German. They took the Norwegian stamps and stamped them with the German symbol on.
Else?
Just a quick note here that censorship still goes on because I was able to be a missionary to Germany with my former husband, who was a pastor. And when we began our torture regime out of America during the W. Bush administration, I was very embarrassed about that. And I wrote my church in southern Germany to kind of, and during my Christian Christmas message, I kind of apologized for our country's behavior and then told them that I had helped co-found the first anti-torture committee inland in America through Women Against Military Madness. But anyway, the church secretary told me that she got the envelope, but the contents were missing. Somebody, either the Germans or the Americans, had taken my letter out and destroyed it and just delivered the envelope to that Gracia in Birmingham. So it still happens today, censorship.
Right. There's a question over there.
No, I was just gonna say that I have letters like were spoken of about between the relatives during those years and the very specific questions from here to there. And then the stamp that it had been opened and read to make sure it was legitimate for the Germans on the swastika stamp. But there was an interesting process where they sent a letter first and said, we've got the stuff ready to send you, clothes, coffee. What else do you want? We just are sending the letter first to make sure that this complies. And then we can send the payment.
I don't have a question, but I want to thank you for this information. It was really touching for me as a Norwegian to get to know how much support we got from in the Kirken and the American people. So I just want to say thank you.